This is the second of three Zoom discussions that we're hosting in partnership with the religion think tank Theos. It's been carrying out research into public attitudes towards science, religion and the future of technology, and we're here to reflect on some of the issues it raises. Today the question, scientific immortality, who wants to live forever? Where might science take us in the quest to live longer lives? As with last week, we've got a panel to kick off the discussion. But again, if last week is anything to go by, all of you joining, I think, can be promoted to expert commentators. So after we've heard from the panel, we'll open up to the floor to hear from you. Please use the chat box to indicate if you want to offer comments. Also ask questions of one another. And if you go into the chat box, I'm going to assume that you're happy for me to bring you into the conversation unless you say otherwise. When you're not talking, please do mute yourselves. And once again, I beg forgiveness for interrupting and cutting people off in their prime as we go. This is the most frustrating part of my job, having to clock watch. I want to bring in as many contributions as possible. Yeah, sorry for what I do and if I appear rude. And please remember, explain any but the most common scientific or religious terms so that everyone can feel part of this conversation. Right, so on the panel, we've got Nick Spencer, Senior Research Fellow at Theos Think Tank, who'll be sharing some of his research findings with us. Dr. Predrag Slijepcevic from the Department of Life Sciences at Brunel University, London. Rev Dr Joanna Collicutt, a Fellow in Psychology and Theology at Manchester Harris College in Oxford. Rabbi Laura Jana Klausner, Rabbi at Bromley Reformed Synagogue and former Senior Rabbi to Reformed Judaism. And Professor Neil Lawrence, who's the DeepMind Professor of Machine Learning at Cambridge. I'm going to start with you, Nick. Tell us a little bit about the key question that you asked of the public and why you asked it.
Thanks, Rosie. This is part of a wider project we've been conducting for quite a long time, looking at science and religion. The premise of this particular approach was that effectively science and religion, we argue, has been stuck in a bit of a rut around a certain number of specific issues. They're not the issues that most people fixate on. They don't spend about cosmology or evolution. They might think a little bit more about things like AI that we talked about last week, or immortality that we talked about, we're talking about this week. So that's the broader context. The more specific context, I guess, is that there have been a number of articles in the press in the last year or two about how billionaires who now in a position to be able to buy absolutely anything on earth are turning their attention to eternity and investing heavily in the potential for extreme life extension and possibly even immortality. So we were curious to know who would be buying from Jeff Bezos immortality if he was selling it
at an affordable price. So tell me about the key findings that you came up with.
Sure. So we asked a number of questions here, and three are particularly worth highlighting. There was a generic question, would you like to live forever if scientists were able to engineer it? And then we also picked up a couple of specific kind of longevity, eternity type questions. Would you like to be cryogenically frozen after your death so you could be revived centuries later? And would you clone yourself if you could, allowing sort of a genetic immortality, if you like? The top line findings is that the billionaires are going to have to do quite well to sell this to at least the British public. The generic question, I would like to live forever if scientists were able to engineer it, 60% of people disagreed, and actually 36% of people disagreed strongly. Only 19% of people agreed, and only 7% agreed strongly. If anything, the trend was even stronger when it came to cryogenics. People don't seem to be particularly keen on spending hundreds of years in a Californian freezer. 72% of people disagreed. A full 51% of people disagreed strongly that that's what they wanted, whereas 12% of people agreed. They're the headline statistics for those questions.
There's still quite a lot of people who want to live forever, whatever they think that means. Just tell me about some of the differences according to cohort.
Well, according to age, I can tell you. So look at the generic question: if scientists could promise to live forever, engineer eternal life, would you have it? Basically, the older you get, the less likely you are to want that. So 53% of under 30s disagree with that, whereas 70% of over 70s disagree with it. Or flip that around the other way, about a quarter of people under the age of 30 agree that if I would like to live if scientists could engineer it, whereas only 11% of over 70s. I emphasize that's an age effect. We don't know the extent to which it's going to be a cohort effect. In other words, whether young people will carry that trend older or whether it's a function of them being younger, but there's certainly a very discernible age trend there.
And what about gender and whether or not people are religious?
Well, I mean, this will, I'm sure, shock people to know that men are keener to live forever than women. There is a very distinct age difference there. 25% of men say they would, compared to 12% of women say they would. There's also one other noticeable difference, according to your religious belief or practices, at least. Broadly speaking, the more religious you are, so whether you attend religious services, you pray often, or you read holy texts, you're more likely to reject the possibility or the attraction of scientific immortality. Flip that around the other way. If you never go to church, if you never pray or practically never read holy texts, you're a bit more likely to be positive about the prospect of scientists offering you immortality.
Thank you very much. Let's go a bit more scientific now or different sort of science, to Dr. Predrag Slijepcevic. Your research is into telomeres, which protect the end of chromosomes from becoming frayed or tangled. The best description I found for these, I thought was wonderful, was that they're like plastic ends on shoelaces. I just thought, you know exactly what they are now, don't you? Anyway, studying them, I'm told, helps you look at how cells age and how researching into them can lead to healthier aging. But a very general question for you, Predrag. Across the sort of scientific piece, as it were, where are we up to in terms of the possible extension of life? Are we talking about 10 or 20 or 200 years? And what are the technologies that we're talking about?
According to scientific research, in particular, research on experimental animals that mimic human and human health, I think it's possible to extend lifespan by about 20-30% using some pharmacological or even genetic interventions. And assuming, and the interventions include, I think scientists identified a total of 9 different areas at the level of cells and molecules, which can be actually tackled using various drugs. And when you use these drugs, the idea, at least on the experimental animals, is that we can age in a healthy way. So assuming that we can reproduce what was basically shown in experimental animals on humans, then we could perhaps extend the lifespan from the current average, which is about 70 for the world population, to maybe over 19 years of age. So that's the best we can do according to the current state of art in medicine. There are some wild speculations, obviously, that humans can live for 1,000 years or something like that, but these do not have the realistic basis in medicine, at least for the time being.
And when do we think some of that achievement, perhaps of living 20 or 30% longer, is that realisable in the next 20, 30 years? Or is it a bit further ahead than that?
I think it depends on the medical practice. I think apart from these medical interventions, everyone can help themselves age in a healthy way. The best way to achieve that is through diet restriction. I think research shows in animals that once you say, take a mouse or a rat and then restrict diet, or say reduce it by 30% from normal, then basically cardiovascular diseases disappear, some form of Alzheimer's disease, dementia, diabetes, all that actually goes to a very low level. So assuming that everyone is taking care and advice from doctors, given that we have a good healthcare, obviously not the one that we've seen during the COVID pandemic because it was chaotic, but assuming that there is a good healthcare and well-functioning system, I think probably next 20 to 50 years we could see some benefits of that.
Right, just on to the sort of the sort of cowboy territory, cryonics and so on. There's some serious money behind this. Is the science at all serious? I mean, it involves liquid nitrogen and deep freezes, doesn't it?
Well, I think science is completely, regarding cryonics, science is completely skeptical. I think cryonics is considered a pseudoscience, a full science, basically, because we, as scientists, we can take cells, freeze them and revive them, and that works fine. However, when we move to tissues, organs, or organisms, I think that's a no-go area for the moment. I mean, the main problem with cryonics, perhaps, according to some scientists, is that once you freeze an animal like a mouse and revive it, maybe the animal can be alive again, but the brain actually cannot function properly. So cryonics, according to science, is still something that scientists don't want to go deep into. I think basic research is okay, but it's a kind of pseudoscience. And
the other area that the Theos researchers asked about was about human cloning, which is possible, I'm told, but illegal. Just explain what that actually means in terms of an idea that it produces another version of me. That's not quite right, is it?
Well, I think, again, cloning when you treat it from the perspective of science, is another form of very tricky ground. I mean, obviously the first thing to ask is, whether there is enough ethics to suggest that we should do cloning. I mean, consider you clone yourself. Who's the person that got a cell from you and become another person? It could be, different from you, but then how about the identity of that person? How are you going to explain to that person their origin? I mean, what was the motivation behind it? And I think it's a ethical minefield. And I think the best advice I can give to everyone: don't go there yet. I think science still has to work on it for the next maybe 50 years until we get to the bottom of it, at least from the perspective of bioethics.
But a human clone of me would be like an identical twin, but much younger, who could potentially.
We don't know.
Don't even know that.
We don't know that. I think we can only know that when we do it. But if you take animals, animals have been cloned, Dolly the sheep and many other animals. I think scientists do see some differences. I think it's not only genetics, but it's also surrounding and the environment that affects development of every particular organism.
Thank you ever so much. Professor Neil Lawrence, we were sort of away with sci-fi last week a little bit with our discussion on robots and so on. I wonder if what the field of AI can contribute to the study of aging, whether we're more in the sort of realms of data crunching and practical applications of information when it comes to studying the possibility of living a lot longer.
Well, I guess first of all, there's another proposed approach which I think is equally as implausible as cryogenics, which is the idea that you upload your brain electronically. So there's this notion of, which is, I think, unproven, the connectome. So your brain synapses somehow represent who you are. And the idea being that if you could translate that into a simulation of the brain, you could create a form of scientific immortality that is not biological, but it's entirely virtual. What interests me is how fascinated people are by these ideas, given their lack of plausibility. So the idea of life extension, as Predrag says, is quite possible, but that's possible just by living well. And the really interesting, one of the things for Nick is, it's like, the question doesn't come with, yeah, you can live 30% longer, but you actually have to go for a walk every day and eat well. I often have this, wouldn't it be fascinating to have a series on superheroes where you could fly, but in order to keep flying, you had to go out training all the time. You had to spend like 8 hours a day working at it. and then you gain these powers. And in some sense, that's the reality of a lot of these things, where you gain that slight form of life extension. It's not going to be zero cost. It requires you to live in a particular way. And what's quite interesting about the fascination people have with these ideas is they're much more like, they're very close to a lot of ideas in older religions, like the idea that immortality might be attainable by, being a great hero or being of the correct parentage. And I think that's even more interestingly is those religions then explore the consequences of that. So, looking at the life of Achilles, who had the choice between continuing to live forever or having a sort of extraordinary life and becoming a hero, and he chose the latter. I think that's fascinating. And I wonder if our obsession for a lot of these forms of mortality, and it's great to hear Nick's results that somehow not everyone's obsessed with it, but depressingly men, who ironically tend to live shorter in general. So there's a fun curse. But it feels like another surrogate for religion, because a lot of the people who are most obsessed with it are people who declare themselves atheists, but seem to be reconstructing religious ideas through access to these apparent technologies that plausibly lead somewhere, but are very, very immature, as Predrag said.
Right. We'll get Laura to respond to that in just a moment. But Joanna, I wonder, Joanna Collicutt, could you respond first of all, perhaps, to this gender difference that Neil's just alluded to, and which the research shows? I mean, why do you think? Politely, please. But why do you think that men might want to live, or why don't women perhaps feel so drawn to the idea of living much longer?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that was part of the research that interested me the most. I think, Rosie. I think, and the second way you put it, I think, is better. That women are less drawn to this idea. And there's all sorts of things you could speculate on about that. But it seems to me likely that it's something to do with a different kind of biological clocks, or the relationships that we have with time. And women learn right the way through their lives that there are various sorts of biological clocks at work. So there's their menstrual cycle, or there's their reproductive life. And it would be very interesting to know whether women would be more interested in having their life extended if their reproductive life could be extended, because that dominates a lot of our thinking, particularly in the West. There's the idea of the menopause. If you're pregnant, it's defined in terms of kind of trimesters, due dates, and so on. And then the process of labor is defined by time as well. So there's this very kind of organic, intimate biological awareness of time that is much less linear, I think, probably, that is tacitly there in women, but also something about intimacy with these liminal times. So with birth, I know certainly when I went through labor for the first time, I thought this is very like what death must be like, in the sense that it's bigger than anything I could, and out of my control. So there's perhaps more experience of being out of control, and then a sense that there is something bigger, whether that's a religious something bigger or a biological something bigger, with which one learns to come to terms, and there are natural cycles which one is tuned into. Maybe, I mean, this is all speculation, but maybe there's some of that at play in those genders.
I mean, you work a lot on aging and with older people, and I wonder, as a psychologist, whether you can sort of give us a little sketch of those who have a healthy desire to live longer and what that looks like, and those who perhaps have an unhealthy desire to live longer.
I think most of the older people I live with don't particularly, the very old, don't want to live much longer, but if they do, it's for reasons around relationships. So I want to live to see my first great-grandchild, or I want to live to see a wedding take place, or I want to live long enough to care for my partner. And all of those things kind of go into the mix at end of life. And I also want to have lived long enough to say I've lived life well, and well enough for me to be worth something. And there is this other kind of agenda around life and length of life, and fear of mortality that is to do with self-esteem. And kind of we know that self-esteem is, high self-esteem is one of the things that we use to defend against fear of death. And I think it's interesting that it's rich men who are high achievers who are drawn to this as well. There's something about marking your life through having achieved enough. And for some people, they have a modest idea of what it means to have achieved enough, but for others, the bar is set very high and they need a longer time to do it in.
Thank you very much. Rabbi Laura Jana Klausner, there was a difference between the religious and the non-religious in the findings from Theos. That, I guess, is what you would expect, isn't it?
If I was feeling grumpy. Yes, and I'm interested in what Neil said about a substitute or building your own religion, whereby what happens around AI, I often think is where people take their needs for answers, questions that they can't answer or choose not to, which is absolutely fine, through a religious format. So it's not that I expected it, but it makes good sense to me.
And what about, Judaism, it's sort of, it doesn't have this concern for the afterlife in the way that Christianity or maybe Islam has. It's a very sort of practical, day-to-day lived religion. Where do Jews take their interest? If they're focusing their interest on this life, will they want to extend it?
So there is an interest in the world to come, but it's not a key factor, as you say, certainly not a measurement of faith like we have in Christianity, where eternal life, if you believe in Jesus and so on, you get eternal life. It's not at all that equation. There is an idea of eternal life and life to come. And the primary idea is hopefully what we do here will impact on the quality of that. But actually, don't waste your time thinking about it, because we really got to get on with today. And I think that's quite helpful in this discussion. Mm-hmm. And I do think that there's an interesting thing. When Jews got interested in the afterlife, we didn't believe in an afterlife at all for a very long time. And then when it started to happen was when there was huge trauma in the world around the destruction of the Second Temple. So around 70, probably a bit before CE, which is of course the time of the birth of Jesus. So it's interesting now when people are, in some way, some people hankering over immortality. My question is, what is it coming to answer that's not good enough in their own life at the moment? What's the distress that is happening that is being deflected into worrying about this rather than worrying about pandemic, war, distraction?
There's something virtuous or laudable, though, in living the long life, isn't there? The Hebrew scriptures are full of people, and Methuselah lived for the longest, 969 years, and that was obviously seen to be a good thing. So there's a sort of concern with living a long time and perhaps with legacy.
Huge on legacy, massive on legacy. What will other people do? How will you be remembered? That is massive. And all, from age 3, how we educate our children to read, what that massive legacy, which is really the world to come in this world, of course. And yes, there is a correlation in a lot of rabbinic writings between longevity and goodness. And therefore, when we deal with people who die much too young, we have to do some very serious theological somersaults to deal with it often. And the good life is also about quality. So we are increasingly burying people in their 90s across the genders. And that is seen as certainly as a blessing.
Thank you. There's lots of interesting stuff going on in the chat box, which I may come to in a moment. Panel, do put up your hands when you want to come back into the conversation or get in touch with me on the chat box. I'd like to go to the Rev Professor Douglas Davies. He's the director of the Centre for Death and Life Studies at Durham University. And I'm told on Twitter that he can do Emil Durkheim in just a minute. So I think he can do this in 2, which is the idea, I suppose, that religions originated in a desire to beat death in some way. Do you think that is a fair historical and anthropological comment?
Not necessarily, because it is speculative. My wild theory of words against death as a response of human animals now gaining language, now gaining self-consciousness, yet seeing corpses and wondering what on earth that is. Yeah, we can speculate there. We can also speculate, and this I found absent from the project actually, some explicit concern with fear and with hope, because I very much see hope as the cultural level of the biological tendency of the desire to survive. So I was looking through the statistics to see what there might be actually there about hope and why wasn't that asked about, or maybe it'll be derived from the statistics, and the question of fear. Following our good rabbi's point, however, and another one, I think what is interesting about this project, and from the social scientific perspective, is the very concept of immortality. There's been a brilliant book written recently on death in ancient Judaism, in which Matthew Suriano raises the concept of functional immortality. That when you put your ancestors in their tomb, let them rot, put their bones in the central pit that they gathered to their ancestors, you then feed them, you then attend them. They're important for you as long as they've got a function, functional immortality. In the West, we follow too much Plato and all that Greek stuff about sort of immortal souls. We need to set the individual in the social context and say, what's eternity for then? This is why I think it would be very interesting to look at the issue of other forms of, and in the big project, please do pursue it, other forms of immortality, not just the scientifically engineered ones, and we've heard our colleagues speak rather doubtfully on those in terms of efficacy, but on, say, the theological one, wearing my theological hat for a minute, there are colleagues who've gone on to talk about being eternal because you are ever present in the mind of God, who is forever. So if God is not functionally immortal, but essentially forever, then being in the mind that is essentially ever might be worth a way of thinking about, not least those in the project whose correlations on religious belief, prayer, and text reading might need to be given an additional color in terms of the nature of the deity or deities in relation to whom, to which they are relating.
Can I bring Nick back in to respond to the questions that you've raised about the Theos research, and then after that, briefly to Neil, and then we'll go to some of our other people in the audience.
Yeah, I mean, there were just a couple of comments I wanted to make. First, with regard to the idea of belief in immortality and the origins of religion. Robin Dunbar, the evolutionary psychologist, has just published a book called How Religion Evolved and Why It Endures. And he's quite clear in that, and I think quite convincingly, that belief in immortality played a very minor role in most early religions. The cognizance of one's mortality is undoubtedly part of it, but the old idea that religions evolved simply as a reaction to his fear of death, I don't think that holds particularly well. And the second point was picking up Douglas's point about different kinds of immortality there. In advance of our discussion tonight, I dipped back into a book I first read 30 years ago, Julian Barnes' History of the World in 10.5 chapters, the final chapter of which has the narrator dying and going to heaven and having an absolutely brilliant time there, until at some point he gets fed up and decides to switch himself off. And he's flabbergasted by this because, you know, he gets everything he possibly wants in heaven, but he just gets bored with it. And in his communication, his conversation with his host there, she reveals to him that everybody decides to switch himself off after a while, and says right at the very end, you know, heaven's a wonderful idea, but it's not for people, not for us, not in the state we are. And I think that's a very important point. There is different kinds of immortality, and I suspect a lot of the people who read our questions and interpreted them understood immortality as in a physical going on. And actually, I think that appeals more to men than it does to women, as we've seen. But religious ideas of immortality almost always have come alongside ideas of transformation and being different kind of creatures. And I think that has to be factored into a broader conversation about immortality and living forever.
Yeah, I really love Douglas's points. And I just think this notion of functional immortality, and I think what we see is when people are trying to introduce these things as surrogate religion, is that lack of imagination we find across religious traditions. And I think when Douglas is saying, okay, that's a Western tradition, and it's symptomatic of that, and exactly what Nick just said, people are going for physical immortality, I get to live forever. Whereas I think, and we talked about this last time, when we were talking about robots and souls, the extent to which we as individuals are part of communities. What does it mean to be human without a community? And I think that, our conclusion there is, we're on the panel, it's meaningless. And then, of course, Douglas has just talked about that community, and we've heard in Judaism about that community existing across the generations. And that, I think, is what Douglas meant by functional immortality. And it's much more sophisticated and interesting concept than the type of things we hear about, oh, I get to live forever. Because it means if you care across generations, then you do care about things long term, like climate change, and what your what's the opposite of ancestors? What your descendants will have to deal with long into the future after you are long gone.
Andrew Brown, don't want to quite lose the sort of the weird and wonderful world of cryonics and the territory that the big entrepreneurs have gone into, but you've studied that a little bit. But what do you think the question underlying the cryonics industry is or should be?
Well, I don't know about what it should be, but as Dr. Slijepcevic pointed out, the science is all nonsense. What's interesting, I think, is the question of what it is that people think will become immortal. There's this idea that fundamentally we're some sort of computer program. Again, it's nonsense, but it's quite widely held. So we've got a lot of science fiction in which people get uploaded and recloned and so on and so forth. And then with cryonics, again, there's the people who simply have their heads chopped off and frozen definitely have an extremely strange idea of where their personality resides and how it functions. I think that the value of this is simply in showing what sort of creatures people now believe we are. And it's quite obvious if you think about it that all the popular ideas are wrong. But,
what's interesting about, you could say, well, isn't cryonics just a sort of modern equivalent of burying somebody with their, their cup and saucer and their sword? But the difference, I think, has already been highlighted by our other guests, that what's lacking with the cryonics thing is the idea of community. If you're coming back in 1,000 years' time into your body and your brain, nobody that you shared your life with is going to be there to greet you, I guess, unless you've done a sort of a mass freezing. Predrag, I'll use first names. Can I bring you back in? You have your hand up.
I just wanted to comment on the actual term we use here, immortality. That's basically a language trap. There is nothing as such that exists in nature, because when you say immortal, that's against one of the components of reality, that's time. Even the universe is not immortal. And the second thing, I think the question for me as when I put my philosopher's hat on is, what's religion? Religion is anthropocentric view on the world. What about the religion of other living beings? Like the oldest living beings, as we know, are bacteria. They are about 4 billion years old. In contrast to them, we are only 200,000 years old, and we project our picture of the world as if we are dominating being. Actually, the biological reality is completely different. We are the youngest species in the history of life. And this idea of God made in sort of, a human way is, in a sense, philosophically untenable. If you talk about life, life existed without us 99.99% of time, and it will probably exist with us in the future, long time into the future. So I think when you talk about immortality, everything comes into question, even religion. I think functional immortality, again, when you place that against the evolution of life, against bacteria, it's simply nonsense. I'm afraid to say so.
I mean, there's a discussion going on in the chat box about the distinction between immortality and eternity. David Midgley, would you want to kick us off with that one? And then Mark Vernon, perhaps you'd like to come in as well.
Yes, a lot of spiritual writers and teachers speak about eternity as something that is experienced in the moment. Eckhart Tolle is a very striking example, the way that he writes about it, that if we have a really intense experience of being fully present in the moment and fully aware of what it is to be aware in that moment, then we see that, in a sense, time is unreal. There is our fundamental nature as a self-aware being is unaffected by time and change. That's very different from living an infinitely long number of years, whether or not we experience, and of course some of the classical stories of immortality, like that of the Sibyl, involve people having rather carelessly failed to require that they retain their youthfulness. They go on aging forever, which is not good. But even just it's the quality of our life in the moment, as many speakers already have pointed out. That is what's significant. We don't think that Mozart's life was somehow incomplete because he died young. It may have been tragic that he died young, but his music has a spiritual value that isn't compromised by the fact that he didn't live to be 80 or 90.
I mean, maybe just to add to that, it also seems to me that it's pretty standard in spiritual traditions to link what the Sufis might call dying before you die to different experiences of time. So if you just try and extend your life, then you really only experience what we might call chronos time, because you count everything by the clock. Whereas if through various practices or experiences that happen, you have this sense of encountering death and that opening up more life to you, that seems to often happen with different experiences of time as well. And so it seems to me that one of the trouble in the conversations that we have these days is not just Andrew's point about poor senses of what it is to be an individual, but also poor senses of what time might even be, and the relationship between life and death, and opening up different dimensions of time, as David was saying. And then just to add one more thought, actually, if I may, is just about this business about functional immortality. I think we've got to factor in the huge importance and value that's now given to the individual, which I think was emerging in the time of the birth of Jesus in the ancient Hebrew traditions, as well as in the Greeks, coming together. And so, personal resurrection and so on was considered. But that's, of course, intensified even more in the last 300 or 400 years. So I'm not surprised that the stress is on individual relationship to death, and that I feel myself that appealing to collective notions is a bit of a cop-out for religious people now, because it doesn't really factor in how we regard the individual now, I think.
Thank you. Can I go to Professor Wilson Poon? He's a physicist from Edinburgh University who's done a lot of teaching on religion and science courses. And Wilson, you want to start the campaign for real death. Can you explain what and why?
Yes, how embarrassing. I mean, I said that to you partially in jest, but okay, campaign for real death. I think what I had in mind was that the word death and perhaps to die have been way overused as a metaphor in my mind. So we sort of blithely say, oh, my iPhone has died, or my computer has died, or my car has died, as if it sort of is appropriate to use the same verb as we used to say my goldfish has died. And the result of that is that we don't think nearly enough about what is so special about biological death. I'm slightly embarrassed talking about this because we have a biologist on the panel, but let me try. To my mind, biological organisms have evolved to die. From the E. coli or previously onwards, biological organisms have evolved to die in a very special way. Let me give you an example. I mean, you look at my fingers, there's no web in between. But at some point when I was an embryo in my mother's womb, when I was a fetus, there was a web in between all these fingers. I was at one point a frog, as were we all, and at exactly the right point of embryogenesis, and when the embryo was being made, these cells committed suicide by a process called programmed cell death. And the special thing about that kind of process of death is that it leaves no scars. You see, there's no scar on the side of my finger. And only if I cut my finger, it's a process of violent cell death, I do get a scar. And the difference is because it's due to the fact that programmed cell death has evolved to give you debris that is actually non-toxic to the other cells, to all the other cells around it. That tells you that the process of programmed cell death is highly honed by evolution, not to be toxic. You can generalize it all the way up to an ecosystem. You know, look at the fungal network at the bottom of a rainforest. It's evolved, it's co-evolved with the trees to deal with the debris of death. So biological death or death in the biological world is finely honed by evolution to contribute to the circular economy of life in a way that human beings have not learned. The point about my phone dying is that it does not contribute to anything except to, waste.
So if we're getting in the way of that process of biological death, we're sort of harming life itself.
Well, I certainly have this suspicion because evolution has spent 4 billion years honing death. So, if that process is somehow interrupted at any point in the chain, my suspicion that something bad would happen. But, perhaps the real biologists in the audience could comment on that.
Thank you. Predrag.
I actually completely agree with that. I think death is part of life. As one writer said, we do not die because we get old, but we die because we are alive. So, death is an integral part of life. And I think we treat it a wrong way because, for us, that is a unknown experience, but everyone will experience it. So who knows what happens after that? Just a question to religious experts. How do you see philosopher Spinoza and his idea of God? Is that at all close to, Christianity, Judaism, even Islam, etc.?
I'm a lawyer, but I'm also a research fellow in the London School of Jewish Studies, and I've written a book called Staying Human, which deals with Spinoza and Judaism and artificial intelligence. So that may have some points for you. Spinoza's God is the God of everything. So certainly there are parallels, certainly within the Jewish tradition and Jewish mystical tradition, to ideas of God in that tradition and indeed in other traditions. What I say in my book is that there is this idea of the God of everything, which is a mystical idea, but there is also this other idea of God as being something other, and which is really the predominant idea, particularly in the Bible and rabbinic tradition, and that is this God of relationship and difference, both the difference between us and God and difference between different people and individuals and between different peoples. And it's that relationship aspect which I think needs to be brought into balance with this God as everything. So I think Spinoza's God is there in the background as a universal truth, but there is also this other idea of God as other, and everyone relates to that in their own particular ways.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment a little on Wilson's very interesting point around how these things have co-evolved. And one way that I perceive that that's the case is, so if you look at decision-making and decision-making strategies, your approach to decision-making is driven by the timeline on which those decisions need to be made. So if a decision is very urgent, you just do what you think is best in the moment. If a decision is a long way out, you tend to explore different strategies for delivering that decision. And that's known in machine learning, which is the principal technology underpinning AI, as the explore-exploit trade-off. So if you know you don't have to solve a problem for 3 years, you can spend time working out what the best way of doing it. If you've got to do with the thing tomorrow, you do the thing that you understand best. And we see the explore-exploit trade-off very definitely in both our own intelligence. So when we're young, our minds are much more flexible. We can readily adapt to new languages. Yet as we get older, we tend to double down on the opinions we have about the world, and we struggle to assimilate new ideas or ways of thinking. And our immune system. So one of the challenges people have faced with COVID is elderly people have immune systems that hadn't experienced this when they were young, and it's like learning a new language for their immune systems. They're not capable of adapting to this new thing as well as a young person's immune system. Therefore, you tended to see death rates in the elderly being larger. Now, that is the type of characteristic that is going to be co-evolved in the way that Wilson and Predrag were saying, that and of course it's vitally important. I mean, we have an expression in science sometimes, it's probably Poon that said it, science progresses when scientists die, because the notion is that the new generation of scientists have more open minds to different ideas, and that's kind of how you make progress. So if you look across society, I think that effect is very evident and very, very important. And if you allowed very wealthy people to dominate society, doubling down on their theories about how things work, it would be highly problematic. Yes, they got immortal or whatever.
Thank you. Beth, did you want to come in? Beth Thingler is, Dr. Beth Thingler is Associate Fellow at Homerton. You had your hand up. I don't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring a slightly more sort of cultural angle in, and I didn't know if it entirely followed from what people were just saying, so it's slightly tangential. But I was just thinking about the title of the session, Who Wants to Live Forever? And as I've mentioned, and it's been pointed out as well, I'm a pop culture fan. So the completeness of that phrase for anyone who's familiar with the Highlander series is who wants to live forever if love must die. And the reason why it's framed like that is because not everyone is immortal. And I wanted to raise the pop cultural awareness of the fact that immortality in these scientific methods is not necessarily going to be universal, right? So we've mentioned very briefly in passing science fiction. I think it's worth drawing those examples out because, as Andrew was saying earlier, that actually these questions reflect on what sort of creatures we now believe we are. And he's talking, I think, more in terms of our metaphysical ontological reality, the separation of mind and body. But in our pop cultural responses to the questions of immortality, we come up with scenarios that reflect on what we think our failings are in developing these technologies. So the unequal distribution of immortality technology in the TV series Upload, for instance, where the digital replication of human minds into a virtual space is entirely possible. The actual scientific method is really quickly brushed over, but it's about the cultural and societal response to what happens when only certain people can afford immortality. So you have subclasses of people whose time zones are slowed down because they can't afford enough data, or some people have artisan help through angels, human helpers in the real world who come in to solve problems because they can afford that service. So I think it's worth sort of expanding out the cultural side of the conversation to think about not only does it mean that we ask, will we be immortal? Do we ask the question, will it be for everyone, and how will it look like as well?
Yes, and I suppose the expectation that we might live sort of 10, 20, 30 years longer is an expectation that only applies to some people, to people who can afford good healthcare and so on. And I wonder, Joanna, I don't know if you've got some thoughts about this, about what an expectation of increased longevity might mean for society. I mean, you could think it's a good thing because it means people will then perhaps invest more, or societies might invest more in education or culture because we have a longer life expectancy. But I just wonder if it's limited to, as it is now, really, to the better off. What that means.
I think with any advances, there's always a kind of going alongside it are political and socio-cultural implications, and there would be with this, as with everything else. There's also, it's been alluded to as well, issues of kind of social justice in terms of what it means for the planet and the use of resources, absolutely, never mind the relative inequality. There's the intergenerational kind of sense of who takes the material resources, but also whose narratives and forms of thinking dominate, and that whole thing about when science progresses, when scientists die, I think might also be true for faith communities too, that faiths progress, new ideas emerge, things are renewed when young people are given a chance, or young next generations are given a chance. So there are difficulties with just the idea of this two-dimensional linear extension of life. As what do you do with those extra years? Do you just go on cruises forever? That's a problem now for people kind of towards the end of life. There's a whole set of questions to be asked about how society is ordered in the light of that, that we're not even dealing with properly at the moment, given the length of life that people have. Where do they belong? What would community look like? And also, how do we value death, as other people have alluded to? How do we learn the lessons that the natural process of dying tells us about how we should live the whole of life well? And those are extra questions to ask, I think.
I just want to read an email I received from someone who can't be here, Professor Lynn Cox from the Laboratory of Aging and Cell Senescence at Oxford. She said, I'm concerned that this idea of immortality is tarnishing the very good work done in aging science to try and improve human health and quality of life. The idea of immortality very much muddies the water. I suppose, Predrag, I'd like you to respond to that, really. I mean, is there a sense in which just asking the questions about who wants to live forever is unhelpful to people working in this area?
Yes, I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, the word immortality is a nonsense, basically. So we have to take it with caution. I think the only realistic thing in this context is talking about a life extension and how to age in a healthy way. And that's the function of medicine. I think medicine has done extremely good work. We know this. I mean, if you go to your GP to measure your blood pressure or your sugar level, they immediately detect if you have, say, diabetes. And that helps you. I mean, 100 years ago, that wasn't possible. So you can now live with all sorts of diseases and have basically your life extended thanks to medicine. And I think that's the function of medicine. We can live, I think, according to research that uses very old people, those people who live over the age of 100, the maximum human lifespan is 115 years. And probably we can't go over that. Maybe, I don't know, in 200 years, but at the moment, 115 years, that's the maximum lifespan. And I think it's better to avoid talking about immortality, just about aging in a healthy way. And gerontology is a huge area of medicine that can help everyone. And I completely agree with that comment.
Thank you. Rabbi Laura.
Can I just add one more thing? Because I just wanted to mention this, the previous speaker who said that, Neil, when a scientist dies, the idea dies. I think the same applies to the human species. We are not an immortal species. There are very clear scientific calculations that we will die as a species one day, then functional immortality goes away. But there are organisms that will survive us, like bacteria.
Well, I loved the conversation about a real death. And as Neil put in the chat, you know, people can't even talk about death. They talk about loss and passing away, which I understand softens it. But the more that we talk about death, when we talk about immortality, the more we can talk about fear, terror of death, terror of pain, and therefore bring, I hope, meaning to our day-to-day life. So I'm a big fan of the more we talk about death directly, the better. And actually the conversation about immortality, if we can turn it into what does it mean for you to avoid talking about death, it would be helpful.
Thank you. I've got a question from Kaya Burgess from The Times to the panel. The research showing that younger people are a lot more likely to want immortality than older people, and why that might be. Joanna, and then Nick, I think.
I mean, I think, again, it's something to do with time perception. Time goes very differently when you're young. The idea of purpose is different. And so what you're doing when you're young is you're extrapolating directly from where you are now into the future. You don't yet have enough experience of the ebb and flow of time over a long period to perhaps take a different perspective on the issue. It's a bit like small children, you know, they want to grow up as fast as they possibly can, but adults saying, no, don't rush it. Enjoy it. Our perspectives of time are really different. And I think different ages and different genders and different cultures get given, they can attain insights, but they also just get given insights into different doorways into these times perception, which give them different angles on their desire to live chronologically longer. And it's not just time, it's also quality and depth and fullness of life that is also opened by those kind of windows.
Thank you. Actually, Nick, I'm going to just skip you just for now. I'm going to come to Douglas for just a minute, and then I'm going to come to all our panelists and ask them a very unfair question about how long they want to live and what they want to do afterwards. So Douglas, briefly, please. You're wanting to say something.
Yes. I want to question the stress on the individual. I want to replace it with the concept of the individual, complex personhood. I want to link that to ecology, environmentalism. I want to link that to the rapid growth in woodland burial, ecological burial. These are pragmatics of the human attitude to relatedness to stuff. And that's big. Very soon, we will have the alkaline hydrolysis of human corpses introduced into the UK, where we will flow down the drains into the rivers. We should be alert not just to those rather sciencey metaphysical complexities of the nature of ourselves, but to the practical decisions people take about their bodies and what's going to happen to them, because there's deep significance in the pragmatic decisions about what we and our families do with our bodies. And I think that's quite important.
Oh, and it could be the subject of a whole other Zoom. Thank you very much for that. I'm sorry that Chronos time has caught up with me, with us all. So I'm just going to very briefly go to our 5 key panelists and ask them that horrible question. I shall start with you, Predrag. How long do you want to live and what do you want to happen afterwards?
I hope there will be something afterwards, but how long I would like to live, just to survive until tomorrow.
I think the benefit of these conversations is that they're provocations and make us think, what is life? I'm really, the chronology, the amount of time I live is irrelevant to me. It's entirely contingent on the quality of relationships. And if they're good, a long time. And if they're not a long time, it's all about relationality.
I've had, I suppose, the privilege to watch my grandfather die at 90, my father die at 70, my brother die at 48. And I say privilege because it teaches you a lot about what you want to do with your life. And I think, a bit like Nick, I think whatever age I die, I just hope I die with a sense of fulfillment, because that's the sadness of someone younger dying, that they feel unfulfilled and that they feel they should have seen more and could have achieved more. And I think that that's the most we can hope for.
I would like to live a very long time, healthily. And when that stops, for whatever reason, I would like to think of the option of assisted dying, which of course we haven't discussed here, I realise.
Yes.
I was like, hang on a minute, I forgot assisted dying, which I think is a very important option. And then afterwards, I would like to be buried so that it's good for the mourners. I don't care what happens to me, but I know it's better, I believe it's better for mourners. That's it. And afterwards, who knows?
I don't mind when I die. I don't really want to be the last one of my kind of contemporaries hanging around. And I would like to be buried in my local churchyard, where I know many people who are quite a lot older than me and are being buried kind of as I observe them. And I'm looking forward to being with the Lord Jesus when I cross over.
Thank you. Right, that's fascinating, everybody. There is another Zoom next week on drivers, doctors, friends. What will artificial intelligence replace? Do sign up for it for another really enjoyable discussion. I hope you've enjoyed this one. I really have. Nick Spencer is saying that Theos has data on assisted dying, but it's not public yet. When it is, let's discuss it. I'm very sorry if I've missed anybody out. Do forgive me, and do come next week and do participate then as well. Thank you so much. It's been great fun. Bye for now.